Well, good afternoon. Welcome to an amazing session that's a combined effort of the Western Literature Association and Humanities Montana. I'm Ken Egan, Executive Director of Humanities Montana, and we're proud to be working with you. You bring a lot of energy. Last night was amazing. So, in any case, please welcome Stephen Tatum of the University of Utah, who will chair the panel From Blood Simple to True Grit, a conversation about the Coen brothers' cinematic West. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming, waiting through the delay. Can you hear me okay? Just like this? Do I need to hold it? Okay. Closer? All right. So we're planning to have a conversation here for a few minutes this afternoon, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience toward the end of our time. And this panel is a response in a way to Melody Graulich, the editor of the Western American Literature Journal's interest in having a conversation about the Coen brothers' West, particularly given the last couple of films I'm sure most of you here have seen, True Grit and No Country for Old Men.
Seriously, yes, west of the Mississippi.
That's what I have to say about that. That was not serious, was it? So, okay, I've got to do some bona fides as we get started. And what we'll do is I'll set the framework a little further with an opening set of questions and quotations from the Coen brothers about this issue of genre, but we expect to branch out in our conversation and talk about a variety of films. But I'm not going to include A Serious Man. But Blood Simple from 1984, Barton Fink from 91, Fargo from 96, which will be shown after this panel, The Big Lebowski, 1998, The Man Who Wasn't There, 2001, No Country for Old Men, 2007, and True Grit, 2010. Our panelists are going to range across these films with particular emphasis on the ones we happen to see most recently. So, in terms of our panelists, as Ken mentioned, I'm Steve Tatum. I'm professor of English and director of the Environmental Humanities graduate program at the University of Utah. Recently, I've published a book on Frederick Remington's paintings and have contributed to the companion to the Literature and Culture of the American West that just came out this year. Neil Campbell is a professor of American Studies and whatever the Brits call a research manager, whatever that means, at the University of Derby in the UK. That's why I said Derby, not Derby. He's published widely in American Studies, and he's particularly a well-known scholar of critical regionalism. He's written a lot on film and photography, and I'll mention his ongoing trilogy of books on the contemporary American West. The Cultures of the American New West came out in 2000. Most recently, The Rhizomatic West in 2008. And he's working on the final volume in the trilogy, Post-Westerns, on the cinematic representation of the New West. So some of what Neil's been thinking about will no doubt appear in his comments. Susan Colleen Her bona fide is she's a professor of English at Montana State in Bozeman. Would you say where the real estate is?
Go Bobcats.
Yeah.
We just beat you.
But you're not in the Pac-12.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And neither are we. Okay. Where she also teaches in American Studies and Women and Gender Studies programs. She also has published in the Companion to the Literature and Culture of the American West and in the new Continuum Publishers volume on Cormac McCarthy. Hey, I did too. I just remembered. Okay. Edited by Sarah Spurgeon. She has forthcoming essays in genre, studies in discourse and culture, and in the journal American Studies. And she's working on a book called, is this the subtitle, The Western in the World? Mm-hmm. Okay. And across from me, Lee Clark Mitchell, professor of English at Princeton University. Many of you, I'm sure, know his book, Westerns, The Making of the Man in Fiction and Film. He's an American literature specialist, also written extensively on American photography. And at this conference, he's given a paper on Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. So hopefully that satisfies Holly Hunter with our bona fides. So one of the questions with regard to the Coen brothers in the West that we wanted to toss around is a genre question, one that the Coen brothers are notoriously evasive about or in their various interviews. In the roll-up to the release of True Grit, there was an interview, I think it was in the New York Times, where they basically said, well, we weren't really thinking about the Western, we were really thinking of Alice in Wonderland. But in other interviews about True Grit, and this is a framing kind of question that will then open it up to the panel, they've made comments such as this, or these. Regarding True Grit, it's arguably a Western. There are guns and people riding around on horses, but it's not a Zane Grey story. It's not a Western in that sense. Regarding the landscape itself, they say at one point, the landscape is a total cheat compared to the use of Arkansas in the Charles Portis novel. We kind of thought people will think it's a Western, and some things you just can't mess with. And then with this particular comment, I wanted to frame a couple of questions. In our minds, we never got close to thinking about True Grit in terms of the Western. And all of these are arguable statements. We weren't thinking, let's shoot it in widescreen like Sergio Leone. Sergio Leone has this weird Western opera thing, and yet it's definitely not opera. And it's definitely not that John Ford tragic thing. Our sensibility has nothing to do with that. What interested me about this quotation is the word sensibility. What is their sensibility? Because in a way, I think as we're talking about the Coen brothers' production of the cinematic West, or Westness, to use one of Neil's phrases, the cultural production of the West through visual representation, we're talking about their sensibility, and that sensibility has something to do with landscape, has something to do with affect, it has something to do with visions of masculinity, of course, and the tradition of the Western. But as all of you know, I'm sure, their genre crossing or hybridization and mixing and matching of genres makes the genre question, to me, not as interesting as the sensibility question. So with that in mind, we are going to start. I've asked each of our panelists to select a moment or a couple of moments from this oeuvre of Western set films, if you will, both contemporary and period, as a way of getting at this question of the Coen brothers' sensibility, and particularly the use of Western iconography or motifs in their films. Neil, I'm going to ask you to start because you had mentioned something about a film we probably won't talk too much about, I'm guessing, and that's Barton Fink, maybe as a way of adding on to the genre question.
Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, would you go ahead? Yeah.
Okay. I watched Barton Fink again recently, a film obviously set in Hollywood, for those of you who don't know it. Tells the story of a radical playwright played by John Turturro based in New York who goes west, in theory, to make his fortune writing scripts for Hollywood movies. There's a scene that I was talking to Steve about that I thought was quite a nice little extra preface to this discussion, because it follows on in a way from Steve's point about genre. In that movie, Barton Fink has a meeting early on with the film studio owner, producer in a New York studio, who tells him he's his greatest fan. We find out later he's never ever seen one of his plays. And then he goes on to tell him what his first assignment is going to be in Hollywood. And what he tells him is he wants him to write a wrestling movie. And Barton Fink looks at him across the desk, total disbelief. He wants to write films about ordinary working people. So he looks at him across the desk and the guy clarifies. He says, "God damn it, it's a Wallace Beery wrestling picture. You know what I mean." He clearly doesn't know what he means because he's not familiar with that genre at all. This conversation kind of haunts the film in interesting ways, and it returns later on after he's seen a first draft of this Wallace Beery wrestling movie that Barton Fink has drawn up. And I can't remember the exact quote because I left it on my desk back in England, but he says something to the effect that, "I told you to write a goddamn wrestling movie, not a man wrestling with his soul." In a way, for me, in a number of ways, that tells me something about the Coen brothers themselves, Jewish boys going to Hollywood, coming up against the studio system dominated, even in the 70s and 80s, by genre films of one kind or another, and particularly by a kind of Hollywood tradition. And I think the idea of someone at some point in the Coen brothers' career sitting down and saying, write a genre picture, is almost the spur to everything they did from then on. Because you can argue that what they work on is this kind of playing with genre in interesting ways, trying to work within its parameters, but actually all the time doing other things. And just as my final point before I go on to my scene that I'm going to talk about, and to get a little bit more theoretical for a moment, it brings to mind Jacques Derrida's essay, The Law of Genre, which is a brilliant essay when he talks about and tries to explain what he thinks genre is. And in that essay, he uses a wonderful phrase that I think is very important when we're talking about the kind of hybridization of genre and the boundary crossings that you do find in the Coen brothers. And Derrida talks about what he calls participation without belonging when he talks about genre. In other words, you can participate, you can partake of genre, you can perform genre as a director or a scriptwriter, but you don't have to belong and be defined and contained by it. And again, I think that's, for me, that's a much more interesting take on genre than, say, some of Jameson's comments, which, about pastiche and so on. Okay, shall I go on to, yeah. Okay, so we were asked to kind of think about a sequence and a section, and I'm gonna read this because it's the easiest way, otherwise I'll miss some details out. This is The Big Lebowski, and it's the opening sequence of The Big Lebowski. As we enter the opening title sequence of The Big Lebowski, we hear the Sons of the Pioneers singing Tumbling Tumbleweeds on a soundtrack singing of Here on the Range I Belong. I won't sing it, you'll be glad to know. Here on the range I belong, drifting along with the tumbling tumbleweeds, accompanied by the invented visual trope of a tumbleweed blowing across a western desert, both providing a reassuring and familiar cliche of Westness as the narrator, Sam Elliott, the stranger, in his deepest Western drawl tells us that way out west there was this fella I want to tell you about, fella by the name of Jeff Lebowski. The stranger's tone is bemused, a figure from another time, trying desperately to comprehend the world he observes on our behalf and to narrate the story he has witnessed. What we appear to have in this opening sequence is what Edward Commental calls a mythic terrain for the non-mythic action that follows. The stranger represents, quote, a sort of ghost of cowboys past, as one reviewer of the film put it. He carries traces of the mythic West into the contemporary world, focusing the audience's attention upon the spectral relations of the past and the present. Based on this opening sequence, as two critics, Tyree and Walters, write in their British Film Institute book on the film, plainly this is a Western. As we literally follow the tumbleweed's reassuring path, it takes us suddenly beyond our expectations, over a ridge and into a less familiar landscape, looking down into and onto Los Angeles' neon sprawl, juxtaposing as we follow this sequence the grand old-fashioned car hand wash with Benito's taco shop and the iconic Venice beach with Ralph's supermarket. Thus, the mythic tumbleweed and the desert scrub engages dialogically with an everyday, urban, commodified, ethnically diverse culture that, like the unfolding tale, is, in the stranger's word, stupefying. This is the deterritorializing, uncanny and jarring effect, I would argue, of so many what I call post-Westerns. From Bad Day at Black Rock in the early 50s to the Down in the Valley, David Jacobson's film in the early 200s. It is at this moment, too, in the film Lebowski, that film noir and the Western collide, as we look down on the neon grid where the Chandler-like labyrinthine plotting of the Big Lebowski will shortly unfold. As we watch and listen, the Old West and the New West fold into one another, disturbing familiar iconographies to simultaneously be both of the classic Western while also more than, engaging in Derrida's generic participation without belonging, a ghosting where one form haunts the other, and thematically each ghost relates to some darker, buried past. So, to return, as one must when discussing the uncanny effects of the Western, to Tyree and Walters, they continue, plainly, remember, this is a Western, they said. But then they alter tack. They write. So it's not really a Western then. Yet we're still following that tumbleweed along a bridge, over a freeway, down a street, past a burrito stand, and onto the beach itself. Tumbleweed on a beach? What kind of a movie is this anyway? Indeed, their dilemma for me is crucial, expressing the inherent strange familiarity of the post-Western, jarring the reader into a space of reflection, a critical dialogue with the form and content, its assumptions and its histories. Indeed, the Coen brothers would later comment on the release of No Country for Old Men in 2007 in an interview, "No Country for Old Men is perverse, and we like something perverse." Without doubt, The Big Lebowski is nothing if not perverse in its deliberate collage of Western imagery, cliches, and concepts. The stranger's astonished words offer a lucid commentary on this post-Western process. Thus, the promised land of the City of Angels, for example, is critically tempered by, "I didn't find it to be that exactly." And unlike the archetypal classic Western, this, as the stranger continues, whilst we watch Jeff Lebowski, the dude, sniffing his milk carton at Ralph's supermarket, is a movie with no traditional action hero, since, as the narrator says, what is a hero? Indeed, as so often in the work of writers like Richard Slotkin, the Coen brothers' films make us realize that the cinema moves beyond itself and touches a world beyond. As the stranger says, this is a story I'm about to unfold. It took place in the early 90s, just about the time of our conflict with Saddam and the Iraqis. This global iteration is amplified as the dude pays for his milk at Ralph's checkout, whilst on the TV, President George Bush Sr. repeats, "This will not stand," about the invasion of Kuwait. Along with this reference to the First Gulf War, there are others to Vietnam and Korea throughout the film, suggesting the film's link between its Western setting and its historic settler culture with a striving beyond its shores to other foreign policy adventures. Even as the stranger attempts to unfold, remember his word, the story of the dude in his world, he admits, quote, "There was a lot about the dude that didn't make a whole lot of sense, and a lot about where he lived, likewise." As a consequence of this senselessness, the narrative thread is broken, interrupted by the stranger's very attempt to explain it. "Well," he goes on, "I lost my train of thought, but, hell, I've done introduced it enough." The stranger, as narrator, cannot reduce the tale or this complex world of the modern West to a linear form, as Frederick Jackson Turner had famously achieved with his Frontier thesis, or collapse it into a set of simple, homely meanings. Instead, all he has is what the dude and the place, the West, Los Angeles, the United States of America represents: mystery, ambiguity, instability, and complexity. But through its representation, through the need to tell this story of the post-West, the stranger speaks for us all. But then again, he says, maybe that's why I found the place so darn interesting.
Lee, you're going to talk about No Country for a second, right?
I'm
Maybe.
sorry?
You would talk about No Country for a second?
Yeah, well,
Or what were you?
one of the things I don't, when we were given this assignment, an invitation half a year ago, all of a sudden I realized there are certain films that I really loved of the Coen brothers. I had to go back and see them again. One that you didn't mention was Raising Arizona, which was probably the first one I saw, and excited me by them. But the three that I really love are Blood Simple, which you've just seen, Fargo, and No Country for Old Men. And I take Neil's point. I think he's quite right that and it's a commonplace with the Coen brothers that they seem not to fulfill any kind of genre whatsoever. At least I would claim up until True Grit, which seems to try to accord to certain kind of generic assumptions about the Western. It's a little bit hard to understand what genre might mean here. That is it something that's simply placed in the West? Does it have certain kind of plot configurations? Is there something about the plot that Wittgenstein would call, has to fulfill a kind of family resemblance to other texts? In any event, part of what we were asked to do was to come up with, and you can do your own, and I'd like to hear some of those as well, but to come up with a scene or scenes that particularly struck you in any of the films that you saw. And there are some, the one in Blood Simple where you have this aerial shot over the farm plot as Ray is first of all trying to dig a grave and then trying to bury someone who refuses to die. And there's that kind of wonderfully eerie quality of it as you get the tire tracks over. There's a scene in, likewise, I like these aerial shots. There's that scene in Fargo, I don't know if you remember it, but it's almost like a black and white Ansel Adams picture where there's again an aerial shot and Steve Buscemi is driving his car in the parking lot and doing figure eights. And I don't know why that strikes me, but it has nothing to do with anything Western as a genre. But the film which most captured my imagination and still does in strange ways, and for generic reasons, I think, is No Country for Old Men. And the reason is because the Coen brothers really, they disclaimed the fact that it's a Western. Tommy Lee Jones said it's a road movie or a horror film. A lot of killing goes on, he said. It's a party comedy chase film, someone else said. But what they did claim is that the story is about where it takes place as much as anything else. That's a comment. And what's always said about the two of them is that they have this amazing relationship. Actors love to act for them because they always seem in sympathy with each other. They never argue. They never argue with their actors. And so they're always interrupting each other. And if you see them on Charlie Rose or some such, there's a sense in which they're like Siamese twins. It's probably politically incorrect for me to say that phrase, but they are. There's a sense in which they speak for each other as a long married couple would do. So Joel interrupts him after he says, so the location becomes a huge important character or element in this story. it can't be separated from the story. And then Ethan interrupts him and says, it's very important to us that we shoot at least the stuff where you get a feeling for the landscape in West Texas. And I thought that's interesting. The movie is very much a period piece, so that it's filmed in 2006. It's set in 1980, and a lot of the settings are constructed, especially to get that look of about a quarter century old. But the claim I had, as I've watched the movie a number of times, is does it matter very much if it takes place in West Texas? And the scene that I had in mind was the opening scene. I don't know if you remember this. There's 90 seconds of film. And you get the title sequence, it's on black screen. And it's this 90 seconds that is an invitation for us to see it as a Western. And we then get Sheriff Ed Tom Bell's voice, it's a kind of voiceover, as dawn comes up over the West Texas landscape. And his speech is nostalgic. He's recalling his own youth as a sheriff, and his father and his grandfather in more innocent times, and his inability to understand any of the rules anymore. And it all registers a kind of nostalgia that I at least sense as one of the elements that isn't necessary for the Western, but is commonplace in the Western. There's a kind of nostalgia for an earlier time. And we're given a slideshow then of 12 slides. It's strange in a moving picture to get a slideshow in this film, and you rarely see it. And the first three appear as kind of snapshots of a kind of morning star hanging over a butte, and then telephone wires as dawn increases. And in the third one, we see that these are not snapshots, because we see the wind rustling the grass. It's a moving picture, as it's held. And that's then confirmed in the fourth, as the sun rises, and the wind rustles in the sixth, and so on. And none of this is in the novel. And this is one of the things that I think they've done to improve the novel in an interesting kind of way. In fact, other scenes of the landscape in the film will be mostly this is the last we're going to see of landscape. Mostly we see burning cars and motels and detritus and fast food and the despoliation of the land. And then we get this opening of the novel and the opening of the film as we get Sugar, this guy with this Dorothy Hamill wedge cut, Charlie Brown haircut.
Peter,
up,
what's his name from the Monkees? Peter Torre.
And he comes up behind the detective who's facing us on the phone, and he does the most violent act in the film, a film which is, by their own account, the most violent film they've produced. And this establishes the bona fides as a Western, it seems to me. We get one more scene, and the next scene is of Moss, if you recall, taking a shot down at some antelope grazing. And then that's it. Then we get a night shot. And I return to that claim that the movie the countryside plays an important part. But in a 2-hour film, that's it, by my accounting. And I challenge you to go back and look at it. It's almost as if the Coen brothers are invoking the Western genre, only to dismiss it in a certain way throughout. We get a lot of cowboy hats and boots, but it doesn't make it a Western. Instead, most of the rest of the film takes place at night, in cheap interior spaces with large-scale vistas. The very next scene after Moss returns in the dark to the Desert Air trailer park is he and his wife Carla Jean watching TV. And they're watching a film called Flight to Tangier in 1953. How they come up with this film, I don't know. But it's a film which also has a transponder in it and a disappearing fortune and 3 people who don't really know each other, and we get different kinds of senses of them throughout. And it's as if, and that's it. We get this film, which it seems to me, if you go see the film, you'll see that in some ways it's very much a kind of play on No Country for Old Men. And then the rest of it is all cheap interiors. We get air conditioning vents. We get scenes of Sugar repairing his leg wound, long shots of that, none of which seems to me to play out the sense of this kind of landscape that the Coen brothers said was central to what they wanted to do. In fact, quite the contrary, and this is my claim, the claim is that it's much more film noir. which is always about interior spaces, dark, barely lit, about a sense of claustrophobia and paranoia, which seems to me contrary to the notion, the genre of the Western, which is usually about the advancement of civilization, progress, a kind of nostalgia, but also kind of looking forward. And there's a sense here in which they collapse generic expectations in what I take to be a very interesting way. The one line that I wanted to give was this: in this one film sequence that we see on TV that Moss and his wife are watching, there's only one line exchanged. And the line is, "My place is wrong." And it's almost as if you could see this whole movie, not Flight to Tangier, but No Place for Old Men, as a kind of play on the notion of my place is wrong. That is to say, there's no good place here. Indeed, the title itself partly carries that implication. I've got more to say, stuff about a lot of horizontal shots in Westerns and a tendency to be up and down shots, verticals and horizontals, looking upward. They're in motel beds, looking up the ceiling, or looking down below, which seems again to play against this kind of impulse. Much of the film takes place in cars and automobiles. A kind of subgenre of the claustrophobic attitude. And I find all of this is, I'm talking about stuff that's cinematic, has nothing to do with plot as such, but it seems to, as much as anything else, contributes to our notion of this strange, weird, amazing kind of film that plays with our expectations in very new kinds of ways. And one of the reasons I keep returning to the Coen brothers. I'll stop for a second.
I'll just add as a footnote before Susan talks about true grit for a second. In that opening sequence, there's a wonderful, I think, thematic as well as cinematic moment when the camera pans left from the opening horizontal shots. Neil and I were talking about this last night, and we see Chigger in handcuffs being escorted to the sheriff's cruiser, and then it cuts to that interior scene where in the foreground, you'll remember the sheriff is or the deputy is talking on the phone to the sheriff, and in the background we see Chigger, who's preparing to get his handcuffs over his head, and so he can use them to strangle the deputies. And the deputy is on the phone, and his final words are literally, "I've got everything under control." And then Chigger, I want to say Chigger, coming from Northeast Texas, I want to say Chigger, has the handcuffs around his neck. So the notion of, I've got everything under control, but in fact, you don't have everything under control. In a way, defines so many of the plots of the Coen brothers films, from, Blood Simple through No Country for Old Men. I just wanted to highlight that moment. So, Susan.
So I want to talk a bit about true grit, and it seems like a lot of us sort of groan when we mention true grit, as if it's so un-Coen-esque to remake this film. And I think, admittedly, there is a great deal of intertextual interference going on with that film. John Wayne, right? And the earlier True Grit, which I think is a turnoff for a lot of people, but I think that the Coen brothers do their best to banish that intertextual interference. It's like you're watching a different film. And Steve mentioned that they said they were not making a Western, but Alice in Wonderland. They also described it as Perils of Pauline. So that's kind of fun. And I wanted to look at the closing scene in True Grit, which features the armless and much older Maddie Ross. And she's on that snow-covered hillside, standing by the marshal's gravestone. She's moved it so it's closer to her home. So she's standing over his gravesite, and the theme music, the theme song, Leaning in the Everlasting Arms, which Steve is going to sing for us, plays over the credits. Go ahead, Steve. This is music that's also used in Night of the Hunter, right? The 1955 noir thriller featuring Robert Mitchum. Love, hate, that famous scene. And in The Night of the Hunter, Robert Mitchum plays an ex-con who poses as a preacher in order to get access to the money a dead bank robber has hidden on his property. And Night of the Hunter features this really creepy take on an outlaw trying to use religion and the Bible to gain access to these two young children and to gain access to the bank robber's widow, played by Shelley Winters. And so that's your homework, is to go back and watch Night of the Hunter. Shelley Winters' character is amazing. So having this music from the Night of the Hunter at the beginning and the end of True Grit gives the Coens' Western a disturbing and unsettling feeling, and it offers insights into their take on the theme of retribution and violence, as well as Maddie Ross's own code of honor. Throughout the film, Maddie Ross frequently quotes Old Testament Bible passages, these Bible verses, as a means of justifying her acts of vengeance. But then the bodies pile up. And then as the bodies pile up, I think film audiences start to question the costs of this violence and retribution. We start to question the girl's obsession with taking justice into her own hands, even though, unquestionably, a crime has been committed and the murderer has gone free. I'm interested too in, it seems to me we should say something about the cross-dressing of Maddie Ross in True Grit. The theme of cross-dressing, a lot of folks know, is a recurring one in the Western. So we can think of films such as The Ballad of Little Joe, which was filmed partly in Montana, came out in the 1990s. We can think of Joan Crawford in Johnny Guitar. We can think of Barbara Stanwyck as Annie Oakley, and more recently, HBO's Deadwood, right, and the Annie Oakley in that show. In True Grit, Maddie Ross is a young girl who is angered by the justice system that doesn't punish her father's murderer. So she sets it as her task to hire a man who will help her avenge his death. Of course, the gendered politics of mobility in the Western do not allow young girls to ride off on horses by themselves to hunt down vicious murderers. So there's a wonderful scene in the film where she tries on her father's old wool coat. She has to roll up the sleeves, she has to pull the sides tight, adding a belt to keep it on, and a hat. And then she is ready for her act of vengeance. She has to dress herself for this violence, for these acts that are typically given to the male characters in Westerns. And I think the question is what happens to her in the process of proving her grit, her determination to bring in her father's killer. So to play off on Lee's comments about place in the Coen brothers film and the importance of place in this Western, I think I'm interested here in particularly their use of what might be called the ugly West. The ugly West, and here we go with The Serious Man, okay? West of the Mississippi, filmed in a town that had been hit by a tornado a few years before, and then they CGI'd out even more of the trees, this flat landscape. And I borrowed the term ugly West from the editors of the Atlas of the New West, a really wonderful work that came out in the late 1990s from the University of Colorado's Center of the American West. And here I mean ugly in all of its varied meanings, including the Southern one, meaning something that is offensive and unpleasant. And I want to talk about how the Coen brothers restore ugly elements usually left out of our film genres, like the Western, as a way of commenting on all that cannot be said in those film traditions. Grit is ugly too. Grit is dirt. Grit is tenacious dirt. So I'm thinking of the ugly West in the comments the Coen brothers made in the DVD commentary for Fargo, where they described Minnesota as Siberia, but with family-style restaurants. That's their Capper, other folks.
Hey, Marge, the Swedish meatballs are good today.
And Joel Coen talked about how their mother would kick them out of the house on the weekends, and it would be like 20 below, and the wind would be blowing. And I'm sure for them, Minnesota felt like Siberia with family-style restaurants. And because of the weather, I think they had a lot of time to watch TV. And they talk about watching movies on television. And in interviews, they talk about watching these really strange movies late night on TV, sponsored by Downtown Chevytown. Something my husband remembers growing up in the Twin Cities, and my husband is the same age as Joel Coen. And I should add that my husband and I, when we were in graduate school at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, we lived a block and a half from the King of Clubs, which you remember is the bar featured in the opening scene of Fargo. So I get some points for that, okay. At any rate, in an interview with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Joel Coen mentions that it's difficult for them to imagine a story unless they have a real specific sense of where it's taking place. Some audiences are offended by their take on local spaces. And the Minnesota of Fargo, for instance, this is something that has surprised them. The accusation that they are making fun of rural people, making fun of the locals, and so on. But I think it's important to recognize that there is the Minnesota of Garrison Keillor and Mary Tyler Moore, but there's also the Minnesota of the Coen brothers and Bob Dylan and Prince and Husker Du and Winona Ryder and Al Franken. And so I'm interested in that kind of complexity of place.
Thank you. Well, I've been taking some notes. Before I say a couple of words about Blood Simple, the film that was just shown, and some of you who have it fresh in your minds, issues of cinematography, the issue of nostalgia, particularly I think, with regard to True West, what some critics think of as the technical and formal brilliance of the Coen brothers. All these are issues your comments have raised, as well as beginning with Neil's reference to, did you say Jack or Jacques Derrida?
Jack.
Jack, that's what I thought. The genres is where participation without belonging. And I think a lot of different directions we can take this. I want to just mention a couple of things from Blood Simple. That one is back to the scene where the horror, we walked in on it when we came here, where the horror movie starts to cross over with the noir, and when Ray tries to bury Marty in the field. And what I just wanted to highlight for a second is when that sequence ends, which of course is a fairly long sequence, as it turns out, beginning when he parks the car on the side of the highway, and kind of a repetition of the opening moments of the film. When the dawn comes up and we see the car in that long shot with the farmhouse at the top of the screen and the straight lines of the furrows of the plowed field, and then we see Ray's car cutting across the furrow, and there's that Coen touch where we're not sure if the car is going to start to make his getaway, following upon the whole fantasy or nightmare of being buried alive, which Marty kind of refuses to do, and in fact he reappears later in a dream sequence that the young Frances McDormand has in her apartment. But what struck me visually or formally about that scene was indeed the tire tracks of Ray's car that kind of cut across, bisect those straight rows of that grid. So we have that kind of prairie space interrupted by what the action that's going there, the buried alive corpse, and the lines of the car cutting across it, which reminded me, in a way, the visual motif reminded me of the way, a visual motif that illustrates this breaking up of the conventions of the grids that people would expect the straight lines of the furrows cut across, which in general makes me think of one of the interesting things about the Coen brothers film is the way in which various details like that. It might be that sweating milk bottle in No Country for Old Men, or it might be the repetitive use of overhead shots, like in Blood Simple, where we have the ceiling fan going around and we're looking down at Marty with his boots up on the desk. And then there's, really nice transitions using those overhead shots, or that Chigger, we see him from above also when he strangles that deputy. So the use of details, these fragments, that just kind of interrupt, displace what we think we're going to see or expect. It reminds us, I think, in a way, generally, that with the Coen Brother films, what strikes me is their interest in showing the everydayness of the mystery and the mystery of the everyday. And in Blood Simple, I remember watching it years ago. Totally, I could not get this image out of my mind for days. It's when Ray and the young Frances McDormand are standing in front of the door of his apartment. And there's the use of windows throughout that film that kind of pick up on what I'll call the architectural uncanny of that fantasy, or that fear of being buried alive that they play on. People gazing through windows or gazing out, blinds open. And if you remember the film, particularly those of you who've just seen it, out of the blue, without any warning, the morning newspaper gets delivered and bangs off the door. It's a wonderful detail like that. But I'll just finish with the idea of the opening of Blood Simple, in a way, is where I think the whole thing comes together and predicts what will happen in the opening of No Country for Old Men. You remember there's a voiceover, as there is in No Country for Old Men. J. Emmett Walsh, the detective wearing the Western suit and hat, driving the yellow Volkswagen Beetle, says, among other things he says, the fact is nothing comes with a guarantee. Something can always go wrong. Now in Russia, they got it mapped out, so everyone pulls for everyone else. That's the theory anyway. But what I know about is Texas, and down here, you're on your own. And this voiceover there's a montage of opening shots of look more like snapshots than they do of a sequence of empty landscapes, oil derricks, power lines, a kind of a big sky with prairie, what looks to be the Austin, Texas skyline from a distance, and an abandoned drive-in movie theater. And this sequence moves through the characters in the car in the rain, another interior space, end up in a motel room. And in that motel room, on the wall of the wood paneling, are several Old West prints, including what I think is a print of Remington's painting His First Lesson. So it's one of the many of the, again, the interiorized spaces, bars, bathrooms. Everything happens in bathrooms in Peckinpah, Tarantino, and the Coen brothers, in a way. But it's that collision or juxtaposition of the old and the new West that I wanted to focus on in Third Space. So the issue of region and place, though, as we move away from these opening remarks, Susan said, I think it's from the same interview, they mention every story that we do, it's important, just in terms of how you think about a story, that it be very specific from the point of view of a region or a location, right? Very specific. Jonathan Rosenbaum, a critic writing in the Chicago Reader, here talking about Fargo specifically, makes this comment. I wonder if you wanted to respond. The Coens, who hail from Minneapolis, can be considered, as Susan gets points for that too, as kind of living, can be considered regionalists prior to Fargo only if one considers television a regional culture. In Fargo, they take on their home turf as well as their TV culture, and I'm focusing on this because a couple of comments you mentioned where people watching TV is a fairly common motif, and often it is an index to something going on in the Coen brothers' film. But this is Rosenbaum in its conclusion. It's only in their pictures set in the present, Blood Simple and Raising Arizona, and in the near present, Fargo, that they qualify as historians worthy of the name. Otherwise, they're basically mixing and playing with media cliches, paying scant attention to real places or actual periods. Now, this was written before No Country for Old Men or True Grit. But at any rate, any thoughts on this issue, whether it's the handling of characters that seem to be mixed media cliches drawn from their immersion in pop culture?
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of pick that up in relation to No Country for Old Men, another scene, and picking up on what Lee and Susan and Steve have just said about, I think what we're dealing with here is two guys who grew up clearly in a TV age, and Steve's already referred to that, Susan's referred to that. We've seen the very clear intertextual awareness of other movies that they would have watched, not in the cinema, but in late night TV watchings. And I think what that gives is a real interesting dimension to their work, how we interpret their work, and how they recycle that media awareness back into their movies, that pop cultural side. And yet they use it in very interesting ways. And I come back to the word that you've heard a couple of times, the kind of uncanniness that runs through their work, which can often, as you know, mean how the familiar becomes unfamiliar. And in one sense, there is nothing more familiar than TV watching in the comfort of your own home. Of course, as Freud tells us, the word home is the same as Heimlich, and therefore where the word uncanny comes from. So I think that's interesting. And the scene I have in mind, and again, we were kind of rehearsing, not rehearsing in any kind of totally formal way, but after a few drinks last night, some of these scenes, and the one that Steve and I were talking about particularly, and the one I'm just going to quickly refer to, is the scene where Chigurh goes to Moss's trailer, and he pours himself a glass of milk, and he sits down on the battered sofa in front of the television. This is a wonderful kind of parody of the exact lifestyle choice of most of us. Late night, sitting on the TV, probably not in my case with a glass of milk, but watching TV. There's a wonderful sense in which here we have this psychopath who assumes for this moment in the movie this homeliness, and he sits before the television. Of course, the television is blank. And there's this wonderful moment which is full of the power of the Coen brothers as filmmakers. When the shot we see, remember, we're watching this on a screen, but what we're watching on the screen is a psychopath watching himself on the screen. And there's this wonderful playfulness with the idea of the imagery of the screen, the reflectiveness of this homely moment. And it's almost, I think, that wonderful sense in which, because we suddenly become aware of ourselves watching the psychopath, watching himself on the screen, it alters the whole dynamic of our awareness of that moment. Now, if we haven't really responded to that, the Coen brothers, in their independence as filmmakers, aren't afraid to elongate sections of their movies so that we do notice things. The next scene...
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Because what I would say, a couple of things. One, this is a perfect example of what I meant when I said the Coen brothers had improved upon Cormac McCarthy. That scene is not in the novel at all. And I think it's a really brilliant one. Secondly, it's absolutely replicated by Sheriff Tom Bell, who comes in shortly thereafter, sits himself down in the same place, drinks from the same glass of milk, and looks at himself in the screen too. Yeah. And so to say we put ourselves in the place of the psychopath is to some extent to say that so is the sheriff. Yeah. What I would just add an extra spin to that. What I find most striking about Fargo, this is going to seem like a leap, is at the end, it always reminds me of Light in August, because at the end we get Marge and Norm in bed together talking about their day.
Watching TV.
Well, they're watching their TV, but they're also talking about his getting his stamp accepted and so on. And it's this wonderfully intimate and affectionate moment that seems so un-Coen-like in a strange way, because in the other films that I most respond to, Blood Simple and No Country for Old Men, what we have are people, none of whom intersect with each other. Literally, in the case of Blood Simple, everyone assumes that somebody else, they misunderstand somebody else. Abby thinks that Ray has killed Marty. Marty thinks that Visser is going to kill Abby and Ray. Ray thinks Abby's, so on. And in No Country for Old Men, we get three characters likewise, none of whom ever intersect on screen. at all. They're all intimately involved with each other, and yet they are separate. And there's a sense then of this kind of, what would I say, isolation, psychopathology? I don't know, the sense of whatever we think of in terms of violence leading to some kind of resolution that's going to bring people together, it doesn't happen there. What we had is just the kind of no Country for Old Men. It just kind of ends in a strange dream that he has of his father, but that's it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's great. That's what we're here for.
It's that replication of those two scenes, one right after the other, that I find.
I mean, I was going to go on to that second part, which is brilliant because you've done the work for me now. But what's interesting as well, when you look at that sequence, there's a sequence in between. It's a linking sequence of Chigurh going to speak to the large lady who runs the trailer park. And that scene begins with, again, a wonderful shot of the camera pointing towards a door with the exact same shape and size screen in it of the TVs that we've just been watching. And we see Chigurh approaching from the other side of the door, and we see this ghostly, dark shape before he opens the door and we recognize it's him. And we don't know because we've had no preparation for him being. But it's like a series of almost Chinese boxes around these TV screens. The TV screen that Chigurh looks in, the window that kind of echoes back to that screen and reminds us of this kind of ghostliness, which is part of his character anyway. And then the sequence that Lee's just talked about. The one thing I just quickly add into what the other thing I wanted to say about that scene, which Lee describes exactly as I wanted to as well, but just before they go into that, it comes back to this point about the playfulness of the Coen brothers and the way in which, through particularly the figure of Ed Tom Bell, they are running against the tradition of the action hero and the Western hero. I mean, my view of Tom Bell all the way through the film is he doesn't do an awful lot. He would much rather sit on a sofa and drink milk and watch TV. And why that's sort of evidenced in that scene is they're going into this crime scene, potentially, and he's with his deputy, the wonderfully gormless Wendell, and Wendell draws his gun in true kind of Western style, and he's just about to burst into the trailer, and he turns around to Ed Tom Bell and recognizes he hasn't drawn his gun. And he says to him, "Ed Tom, aren't you going to draw your pistol too?" And Tom Bell says to him, "No, I'm hiding behind you." So, for me, that's a classic kind of, the bubble has burst. The action hero is no more. The idea of the man who will put the world right is not there, and yet this is the sheriff with a gun.
There's another playful American television cultural moment early in Raising Arizona, if you remember. And the Coen brothers talk about how Saturday morning cartoons really influenced their making of that film. And they talk about it as, the comic desert landscape of children's cartoons in The Roadrunner, for instance. And if you remember that H.I. McDonough, the main character played by Nicolas Cage, has that kind of funny hairdo thing, his wonderful haircut. He looks like the Roadrunner, and it is a Roadrunner film. Remember the scene with the diapers, that amazing diaper pickup scene where they have to, speed up and slow down. The chase scene based on all the television comic cartoons, and then the Hells Angels bounty hunter, who is kind of like the Tasmanian devil, and remade for an 80s screwball comedy. So that whole television culture thing, that's what children do. Children do. They just watch cartoons after cartoons on Saturday morning.
I mean, in addition to the intertextual and thematic use of these inset TVs, which reference culture and obviously frame things, I mean, there's something else at stake, and I guess it's the issue of the Coen brothers, what might be considered to be a cost of their, again, I'll repeat the phrase from one critic, their technical brilliance, and that is a sense of distance or removal sometimes we get as audiences from the scenes, as if we are flies on the wall watching this scene from a distance. And if you take the argument that in many of these movies we get a kind of mixed media kind of characters that seem to be stereotypes drawn from TV cultures of regional folk, for instance, which could include "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" as well in this. Then is it the case, and this is Rosenbaum again, he says, if one considers all the laughs found in Blood Simple, Raising Arizona, Miller's Crossing, Barton Fink, The Hudsucker Proxy, and Fargo, there are very few that aren't predicated on some version of the notion that people are idiots. So, and if you contrast, if you accept this view, and Rosenbaum even finds Marge really probably the only marginally likable figure for the Coens in terms of sympathy or empathy. It's a Radisson, so it must be good, she says. You know, as a cliche or a stereotype. And you compare these people like in Fargo, if not other movies, to say the Jodes in Grapes of Wrath and the great John Ford movie, and you think about the way in which the common folk are pictured in that movie as the voice of the people, et cetera. I'm trying to expand the lens a bit beyond the TV into other films. But if you think about the contrasting characterization of regional types or styles, do you find this kind of contrast compelling? And if you do, is it to their detriment, or their, meaning the Coen brothers, or are they doing something that is problematic, as Rosenbaum would say? I'll just frame it by thinking of, to me, one of the most moving moments in True Grit was near the end, when the long journey with Rooster Cogburn bringing Maddie back toward the store to get treatment for her arm. And you'll remember that wonderful, again, visual image of when the horse gives out and they're both on the prairie with the night sky above them in a kind of southwestern Pieta pose, and he shoots the gun to bring it. Okay, so how do we, are we moving closer? Are we being asked to identify affectively with this plot, or are we, these characters, are we being distanced from them? This is the complexity, seems to me, of response that they dictate. So I'm just opening up now.
Yeah. Do you want to open it up at this point? To ask them?
Yeah. You are a serious man, Forrest. Yeah.
Just to repeat the question, yeah. I think the question is that there's a smugness about the Coen brothers that makes you uneasy.
It's the kind of, to be a little bit edgy here, but it is good ruthless cosmopolitans from Minnesota.
Well, it's an urban.
And I think, Forrest, you're right. I think you can trace that critique and satire and sarcasm back to their childhoods in Minnesota. And they talk about this. They were children of academic parents. How much more sarcastic? I think their father was an economics professor at Minnesota. Their mother was an art history professor at St. Cloud State. And they grew up in St. Louis Park, which was, at that time, 20% Jewish. A New Yorker article recently had a piece on Al Franken, and the Coen brothers, along with Al Franken, Thomas Friedman, and the political scientist Norm Ornstein, all grew up within a 4-block radius of each other in St. Louis Park. And when they gave their acceptance speech for the Best Director Award for No Country for Old Men, they thanked the Academy for allowing them to play in their own little corner of the sandbox. This sense of being an outsider, they carry that with them, this outsider status or this outsider vision. And so I think that sometimes what you see as smugness or what you see as irony, I think they're really taking this seriously as well. And they're restoring to genre those elements that get left out. You know, the UFOs and the homophobia and the xenophobia and the racism and the, ethnic slurs in The Man Who Wasn't There. I mean, the characters state these things out loud, but in those period films, you couldn't say these things. It was in the political unconscious, but those people never spoke those, words in their scripts. So they restore these aspects that they see in the landscape, and I take it really seriously.
Okay. Other comments, questions? Sure.
Here.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted, oh God, this is horrible. Thank you very much, everybody. I just wanted to say, Professor Mitchell, I really enjoyed your comments. I think, though, that there's a third space, a third genre that would allow us to say something more about No Country for Old Men, is to see it as noir or Western, but a genre in between, which is the border genre, obviously. And we haven't mentioned the border yet, and I think that's really important, because the border both evokes and distance itself from space, because it has to evoke space both physically and psychologically. So when you talk about, it has to say this is the border, but then we never know where it is. And when you talk about cars, night scenes, you'll get the reference before I get there. Cars, night scenes, motels, sets, you have a touch of evil. So if you go towards a touch of evil, I think that this allows us to say some interesting things about the border, space, lawlessness. Who is this sugar guy? Is he Mexican? Remember, we had Charlton Heston in brownface, basically, in A Touch of Evil. So I think that the whole idea of the border genre is really interesting. And really quickly, there's two, if you juxtapose the end of Fargo, what I remember being the end, I don't remember the scene in bed, I remember another end. The last moment of Fargo and the last moment of the last scene of No Country for Old Men, you come to some very scary things about lawlessness or lawfulness or the absence of law. I'm a Canadian, so, good government, that's what we want. So at the end of Fargo, we do have this long line of police cars with the red light against the snow, and we do have this nice music, and we do have the idea that they did get one of those guys. Then McDormand is a good police officer. She's a detective. She does her character, she does her work. Marg, is that her name? Right. She does the job. Somebody did the job. And in No Country for Old Men, there's nobody doing the job, the law job at all. To what extent, then, is that a commentary on the ineffectiveness of the law at the Mexico border? So I think that I just got something where we could go with that.
No, please, I don't have an answer. Good question. But please do come up. Okay. Is that okay? I don't know if anyone else has an
Someone's
answer.
here. Someone's in the audience wants to come up.
I think Catherine's point is good, though. Don't let's lose that point. I mean, I think about the border and I mean, yeah. I mean, I think the crossing, the idea that the way the bridge figures so significantly in the film, the way we see the characters moving backwards across the border, and of course the desert scene where we're not quite sure which side of the border we're on, and the hunting scene. I mean, there's lots of interesting references to that geography, which I think is true.
Well, I'll just add, I think, in addition, though, if I think about the endings of the films, I mean, there's an interesting reintroduction of a domestic space that is not unhomely or uncanny. You mentioned already Marge and Norm in bed talking at the end of No Country for Old Men. Of course, that taken straight from the novel, Tommy Lee Jones recounts to Loretta the two dreams he's had about his father. And so there's a certain way in which these interior spaces end up centering upon the domestic, in this case, either the bedroom or the kitchen. And these, I think, are as much as McCarthy, much less the Coen brothers, will find potentially redemptive amidst this world of violence, this evil that is out there that can't be stopped.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is there's a similar scene in No Country for Old Men with Moss and Carla Jean, and they've got a kind of intimacy, the kind of back and forth between them that suggests a kind of long and affectionate relationship, but it's momentary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ron?
Sorry.
Thank you, not at all. I have just a quick comment about I think what Forrest was picking up on is a kind of smugness, and then a question for you, Lee, about the inside and outside spaces, which I think is kind of very interesting in Westerns. I'm not sure if anybody read the Rolling Stone piece on how David Letterman changed television in the past couple of weeks. And it strikes me as interesting that the Coen brothers and Letterman are coming up somewhere around the same time. And one of the points that the Rolling Stone article made was that sort of on the flip side of Susan's comment about them feeling like outsiders, there's a certain kind of insider sense that this piece was making about Letterman, as in, we all know this is funny because we all understand a certain kind of world. And there is, I think, a certain assumption in that when it comes to the Coen brothers. And it starts with a wink on some level from Blazing Saddles, you know, when the guy with a hat has done his genuine frontier gibberish. I don't know if you remember that comment from the movie. But later in the film, someone's talking about the good country people, and one of the characters injects, you know, morons. And there's a kind of wink to that, as if we all sort of get the underside of that culture. And I think there's a kind of winking that goes on in the Coen brothers that we either delight in or we don't. And I think it is a kind of an inside joke on some level that can be really appealing as well. But my question in a way was for you, Lee, when it comes to what happens in inside spaces and outside spaces. And the foreground to this is Unforgiven, where the crime, and these are all movies about crimes, Unforgiven, the crime happens very much inside, you know, in that very claustrophobic room with the prostitutes and the cutting, and all the working out happens outside. And then I think of movies like No Country for Old Men, to a certain extent, The Three Burials of Melquiades Estrada. The crime happens, you know, mistakenly outside, and much happens by way of working out in inside spaces, in bars and cafes especially, with No Country as well. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And I would put Lone Star in a complicated way in that same mix. Even though the crime happens outside, the burial and the scene of the crime is really that outdoor space where the badge is found. So that's my question for you or others.
Does anyone else want to take?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's a very good question, Bonnie. I haven't, you know, I was copying down here other directors of the 50s, Bud Boticher, Anthony Mann, Johnny Guitar, all of which seem like post-westerns in a certain way before their time. Both have this crossover, this genre crossover, that moves into noir in some ways, and what we think of as interior spaces. I haven't thought it through. I mean, I've seen these films that you've talked about too. The notion of crimes occurring outside but being restored or resolved inside or in interior spaces. One would have to go back to the history of the Western and see whether it's an inversion of an earlier pattern, and I don't know. I don't know whether it has. I guess I'm going to sound really sentimental and silly, but I'm not quite sure that thing, you know, what even the setting of the West is as such, since Westerns have been filmed in Spain and Paraguay and South America, and the Western setting is everywhere. I do find a different kind of sensibility when I cross the Mississippi. An old friend of mine said, you know, whenever you go into Iowa, they always offer you a second cup of coffee without asking you to pay for it, which is not at all what is true in the East. And there's a kind of, I don't know if it's still true, but my sentimental notion is there's a kind of easier quality. How that converts into genres or how that converts into plots, I don't know. And I take then, lastly, Forrest's claim, I happen to delight in the quirky, ironic, poking fun at quality of the Coen brothers, but I have a good colleague who's exactly as you are and finds there's something, she really likes Fargo, she dislikes Blood Simple, there's not anything humanizing there, she finds. And what I get caught up in terms of the self-referentiality of that text, she just finds has lost whatever humanity it might have. That's another question I don't have an answer for either, but I'm filled with those.
Yeah, I just have a quick response to Bonnie's question too, and actually it's a much more practical one. And I wanted to mention his name because I think he's British for a start, so he deserves a mention. Which is the cinematographer who always works with the Coen brothers, a man called Roger Deakins, one of the greatest and most respected cinematographers. And actually, I think it's important not to lose sight of the kind of collective quality of filmmaking. It's already been mentioned in terms of the kind of almost symbiotic relationship between these two brothers and the cast, but also very interestingly with Deakins. And why I mention that is because when there's wonderful documentaries online where Deakins talks about working with the Coen brothers, and he actually talks about, again, unfortunately, course, it's another reference to No Country for Old Men, which is kind of rapidly taking over the session, but where he talks very specifically about why he used an inside space. And it might, and it's the scene when, the much talked about scene when Ed Tom Bell returns to the motel after the violent death of, off-screen, of course, of Moss, etc. And there's the whole debate about whether Chigurh is in the room and behind the door. But he talks about why he shot that in a particular way. And if you remember that scene, it's a good example of what you were saying, because Ed Tom Bell is outside the motel room. He drives up, he parks his car, he leaves the headlights on the car and walks to the door. Now this is classic cinematography ploy, because he's lit from the back. And Deakins talks about how he wanted an effect that would throw multiple shadows of Tom Ed Bell onto the door. And then, of course, he opens the door eventually, once he's drawn his gun. And he talks about, in great detail, about how he wanted him, when he drew the gun, for that gun to have a double shadow cast on the door. So there would be this kind of doubling, this troubling, worrying effect that the spectator would put onto that, because we would be thinking, again, it was another classic sheriff moment from A Million Westerns. But of course, by doubling the image, it casts some doubt upon it. And then, of course, he steps into the room and that whole scene plays out. But it plays out with his silhouette projected, once again, another scene of screening onto the far wall of the motel room where the murder is just taken. And so I think sometimes the staging, the mise en scène of cinema is done for very deliberate, poetic, aesthetic reasons, but also to kind of create these particularly thematically driven moments like that one. And I think that's...
That scene is an amazing scene. It's an absolutely noir scene, number one. Number two, has anyone seen, do you all know that scene?
Yeah.
I had never figured out where Chigurh is, because when Tom Bell walks into the room, Chigurh, it's a magical scene. It doesn't have, so the mise en scène is in some ways eerie or uncanny. I don't dream my scene. The second thing to say is that you're absolutely right about Deakins. He's a wonderful cinematographer, but in fact, Blood Simple was done with Barry Sonnenfeld. And what's interesting to me when I see them is, if you see, your cinematography is like a signature. So if you're taking photographs, if you're taking shots, it should, but what I find interesting is that Deakins seems to match Sonnenfeld in many ways. There's a lot of shot reverse shots or two shots that are very similar. There's a lot of looking up or down. The fan, if you saw Blood Simple just now, that fan that whirls around, that scene frequently is very much similar to what happens in No Country for Old Men when they're in bed looking up at the ceiling. And I wonder how much, I mean, Deakins is a better cinematographer, clearly, but I wonder, I haven't seen anyone ever try to make that kind of sequence from one to the other, or how they bind that together. Anyway.
I'm not a very complicated guy, so this is a little out of my reach, some of this. Well, I mean, it's all within my reach, but I'm not going to put it in. Anyways, okay. I just wrote it down. This is talking about mise en scène of the Coen brothers movies. I wrote, there's an obvious use of irony, but it seems to me that some of it is really a burning through illusion, i.e. at the end of Blood Simple, looking at the bottom of a dripping sink, which makes the trauma of the event that hit that much closer to home by leaving. Okay, that's a second question, but like for example, if you were shot, and it just really brings the reality of, instead of rushing to the next scene, it's, okay, I'm shot, because our mirror neurons perhaps put us in the spot of this guy who's just gotten shot because he's in the scene. But then they look up at the bottom of the sink, and that's something that, any one of us would do.
Yeah.
And usually it would go into the next scene, but it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
Here I am.
And then the four tops start singing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I think it echoes back to something Steve said earlier on about the everydayness. Is what I'm getting from what you're saying, that they often kind of interfere with a kind of what you might call classic Hollywood moment by giving us something of the everyday. And I just saw the end of that while we were waiting, and I'd forgotten that shot. But how it the effect of it is so powerful. That little ornament that he bashes that guy's head in. I mean, what are those little details? Because that could have come off, my coffee table, or probably not yours, but and I think that's where they can kind of use the quotidian to kind of undercut any kind of high-blown Hollywood notions of, the movie. And I kind of, that appeals to me. And I don't think it, going back to Forrest, I don't think it's always about smugness. I think it's just about how you can kind of actually connect with your audience. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly say, which I think does link in with what you were saying as well, is I think the Coen brothers, are very aware of the kind of tradition of cinema as well as television. And I think particularly of kind of independent film, of European cinema. And that means that sometimes watching Coen brothers films can be quite difficult and quite slow and quite ponderous, because they don't look like, shoot 'em up westerns or shoot 'em up Hollywood films. They take away action and replace it with thought. And I was hearing people talk, and particularly the references to kind of the way in which images look like stills sometimes in Coen brothers films. And there's a wonderful essay by the French film writer Raymond Balleur when he talks about what he calls the pensive spectator, and moments in films where the film almost stops being a movie in the literal meaning of that and becomes a still image. And what that does to the audience when we stop thinking of it as a moving image that's going to move on to something else more exciting in a minute, and actually demands of us that we stop and look and think. And to me, that is part of that would be my counter argument to the smugness thing, that it's about thought.
Okay.
And I'll just say something too about, I like that idea of the burning through illusion, and that whole question, the death scenes are so dramatic and balladic and all that stuff. And in Fargo, with the wood chipper, right? Yeah. Which is like the big grotesque scene of the blood going everywhere. But remember too that we have those references to Paul Bunyan, the prior centuries, wood chipper. Yeah. And so it's there are Remington sculptures on Wade Gustafson's desk. Right. So the Remington theme is in that Western Fargo as well.
Well, just because what you brought up, the final scene is a direct quote from Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation. If you've seen it, it's with Gene Hackman. Basically, the whole film is him trying to listen in on a conversation on the other side of a wall, and he's always down under the plumbing. And so the end of Blood Simple then is basically trying to figure out who's on the other side of the wall. She thinks it's Marty. Visser is laughing at this whole notion, and we're left then with this kind of quote, a direct quote from this, as Neil was saying, there's this kind of intertextual quality, but we're listening to this quote from this other American film of only, 10 years before, I think it is. So it's a wonderful moment.
Sure, yeah. The second part of my question ties in, because, let's see if I can find the spot. By leaving these movies somewhat unresolved, I've noticed a lot of their movies kind of leave some room for us to create our catharsis outside of the movie. Yeah. I'm curious how this could possibly, I don't know if this is supported, but affect the plot structure, if they've kind of toyed with the mechanics of the plot to almost create this void within us that we have to fill, just like those moments of stillness, almost create, like when you hit the brakes, you're still moving forward, and that creates this counter, I don't know, I'm sure you can intellectualize that a lot clearer than I can.
I think you kind of perhaps answered your own question with the reference back to the stillness. I think you're exactly right. I think the idea of carrying a narrative beyond the text that we've just, when we go out of the cinema, seems to me films that really matter to me are those films that you think about afterwards and you puzzle over and you worry about. And they can be all kinds of films. But I think the Coen brothers have made a career out of those kind of mysterious elements. I mean, it perhaps goes back to Steve's reference to True Grit and that sense of distance and so on. So.
Well, and when you were talking about the moments of stillness, using that, in a way, was what I was trying to get at with that scene from True Grit, when the southwestern Pieta scene under the night sky. It really, and I think and it's always dangerous to talk about people whose work is still evolving and producing, but it seems to me that True Grit represents a departure from that smugness you were talking about, or irony, and that's why it's so effectively complex, I think. If we think about that scene, and by that, what I'm thinking about here is if one way of characterizing True Grit is put it in the category of retro or nostalgia film, when the word nostalgia has come up, which is one of the features that Frederick Jameson, for one, of course, is defined as part of the postmodern cultural imaginary. And what I think we need to think further about is that there's different kinds of nostalgia. And the nostalgia, if one wants to talk about this as a nostalgic moment in terms of this recreation of a period Western, this is a different kind of nostalgia that's moving more into the realm, I think, finalized with the final scene of her in the graveyard, of mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, not irony. And that may or may not be something that they pick up with, but I think it's important to kind of fine-tune or what we're saying when we use that word nostalgia, because I think it can be reflective and complicated and not just a reactionary kind of search for home that's lost. We're about out of time. If there's a quick question or comment, Paul, you've been sitting there. Do you want to?
Well, I guess this could be a question, or it could just be something to throw out there. But when you're talking about the issue of sensibility, that Steve started with this question of what's the sensibility. When I watch the Coen Brothers films, I always think of Flannery O'Connor, the kind of cartoon-like characters, the flatness, the certain kind of violent comedy. And Flannery O'Connor described the work that she does as the movement of grace operating over a territory largely controlled by the devil, something like that. And I think, Flannery O'Connor, Coen Brothers, different. But, I started thinking about, what is the devil in the Coen Brothers universe? And I started to think about the scene in No Country for Old Men where Chigger kills the person with the handcuffs? Or in the book, I don't think that Chigger would have been smiling the way that he was in the film. In the film, he has this kind of almost erotic, cruel smile and laughter. And if you're talking about sort of psychic space of this Coen Brothers universe, I can't help thinking about Slavoj Žižek and the superego of this sort of obscene, cruel laughter. For Žižek, the superego is all about the injunction or the law to enjoy. You're forced to enjoy, or that's the law. And that scene where Chigger is, just enjoying this and kind of this and there are a lot of characters in the Coen Brothers universe who are sort of these cheerfully laughing, cruel, obscene, violent killers that just sort of surprise you with their suddenness and their violence. If you look at, for Žižek, he sees the superego as sort of operating in our culture, consumer culture, as sort of this forced enjoyment that's the law that you have to obey. And it's, if you look at it in that way, it's a way of maybe seeing them as critical of our culture and sort of, if that's the devil in our culture is this sort of TV universe of consumerism and enjoyment. Then I think that they're saying something really interesting about our culture, and I don't know, it's just a direction that I was considering and wondering also about that Flannery O'Connor connection.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right.
Just say something. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. And then we better wrap it up. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just very quick. Some of the things I had written down was one of my arguments with Gilles Deleuze on his books on cinema is when he turns his attention to American film, and he argues that modern American cinema always remains, these are his words, always remains narrowly critical in striving to save the remains of the American dream. He says when America's great genres, of which one he names is the Western, he says the trouble with those films post 1945 is they collapse and yet maintain an empty frame. And my argument against that, which I'm currently putting into the book, is that people like the Coen brothers show that that doesn't happen. And I think the point, just the last question to me, shows that they are engaged in a very complex critical analysis of a kind of post-war America. They both enjoy the popular culture that they grew up in, but they can see the consequences of that and the way it affects America. So I think contrary to, and Deleuze, who goes on to talk about what he thinks cinema should be, is it should be always giving birth to a new image. And I think what we tried to say this afternoon really is that we think Coen brothers are probably doing that. So I think that perhaps answers that to some extent.
Sounds like an Omega comment. Okay. Good job. Thank you.
Do you want to know what the Coen brothers' 5 favorite Westerns are? Okay. You can maybe vote on this, or there'll be prizes afterwards. Anyone, just quickly. First, favorite film, anyone know? Favorite Western?
Wild Bunch.
Once Upon a Time in America, Sergio Leone. Woo, woo. Second, The Outlaw Josie Wales. Third, Greaser's Palace. Fourth, Doc. Film no, don't know. And 5, The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean. There you go.
That was on Downtown Chevy Town.